Hi everyone, welcome to the Ethics Essay Clinic. I'm Eric Matheson. In this series, I'm looking at student papers and explaining how they got the grade that they got. The goal of this is to help you write better papers. In the last video, I looked at an A range paper, so a paper that got an A grade. Today, I'm going to look at a B paper, and we're going to figure out what it did well and what it could do better. Let's do it. So the paper that we're looking at today is another paper from my course, Introduction to Bioethics. This is a second-year course, but it has no prerequisites. So most of the students in the class have never taken a bioethics or a philosophy class before. Most of the students in the class are science majors of one sort or another. The paper is called, Is Sex-Selective Abortion Justified? And it's looking at the question of the ethics of having abortions for different reasons. Abortion is one of the topics that we talk about in the course. And even people who think that abortions are in general justified for bodily autonomy reasons, many people believe that even in those cases where it's justified, that if you're having an abortion because of the sex of the fetus, then you're doing something wrong. So let's look at the paper. The first thing I want to note is just the title, Is Sex-Selective Abortion Justified? I think that to promote clarity, which is the first value that I advocate for, it would be better to title the paper with a sense of the thesis in mind. So if the student is going to argue that sex-selective abortion is not justified, then calling it something like sex-selective abortion is not justified would be a clearer title. Right away, as soon as the grader looks at that paper, we have a sense of what the thesis is, even before we've actually read anything about the paper. So here's the thesis. In this paper, I argue that if a woman has a right to an abortion because she has a right to bodily autonomy, then should there be restrictions on certain types of abortions, such as abortions due to the fetus's sex, because these abortions only perpetuate gender-based discrimination. So the student is kind of setting up this as a question. This is a case, actually, where just a little bit of editing would have clarified what's going on. So there's a typo. The student says, or it seems like there's a typo in one place or another. The student says, then should there be restrictions on certain types of abortions, such as abortions due to the fetus's sex, because these abortions only perpetuate gender-based discrimination? So when I first read that, I thought that it was a question, and in which case the sentence should end with a question mark. But it also might be that the student meant, then there should be restrictions on certain types of abortions, such as abortions due to the fetus's sex. And as we're going to see as we read on, it seems like that's what the student's thesis actually is. So this is an example of where even the slightest grammatical mistake or typo can make a big difference to the clarity of the paper. Really making sure that in your editing that you're going over and figuring out, is everything really clear? Am I explaining things clearly? And if there are typos, then fixing those. All right, let's go to the description. Women have abortions, a medical procedure that terminates a pregnancy, for many complex and personal reasons. The moral and ethical considerations involved makes it a controversial topic up to debate. In this paper, I polarize on one tenet of the controversy that emphasizes a woman's right to bodily autonomy and adhere to the belief that women have no obligation to maintain the life of a fetus for 9 months that requires them to make large sacrifices to their health, interests, concerns, as well as all other duties and commitments. So the description is okay. So the student is setting, giving us the background context. Well, there are a couple parts where I think that it's just unnecessary, some of the stuff that's included. So the moral and ethical considerations involved make it a controversial topic up to debate. Everybody knows that, so saying that it's controversial is not really giving us anything new. And then the next part of the description, I think in the context of as we read on, I think what the student is doing is affirming that it's not the student is not advocating for a totally pro-life position. What the student is saying is that there is still a right to an abortion, So by saying I adhere to the belief that women have no obligation to maintain the life of a fetus for 9 months that requires them to make large sacrifices. What the student is saying is that, yeah, there is a right to an abortion, but you might read this, as I first did, as the student saying, I think there's a right to an abortion, which could include sex-selective abortion. But that's actually not what the student's saying. So this is another case where, although the student isn't saying anything false, it's a bit unclear, because when I first read it, I went, wait, I thought the student was arguing against sex-selective abortion, but here they're arguing that saying that abortion is okay. So now I'm a little bit confused. So let's go on to the argument. I argue that sex-selective abortion perpetuates gender-based discrimination by reinforcing harmful gender stereotypes. By implying the notion of valued and devalued genders, the practice violates the concept of gender equality, suggesting that the value of a fetus's life is determined by their gender and disregards the principle that all individuals should be treated with equal respect and dignity regardless of their sex. Sex-selective abortion also leads to imbalanced gender ratios downstream within cultures and populations that entrenches such discriminatory beliefs in said cultures, depriving not only impacted gender of a future with potential opportunities, but impacting broader society when employment prospects, birth rates, and social stability are affected. Okay, let me pause there and let's just talk about this. So there are two different points that the student is making. The first is that allowing sex-selective abortion or having a sex-selective abortion is, the student says implying, but it's devaluing one of the genders. And the second point is that there's this bigger kind of population level worry, which is that people overall, if we allow sex-selective abortions, then there's going to be an imbalanced population, and that could cause problems. Both of these points are fine, but a couple comments about them. One is that if I were to guess the arguments that people would give against sex-selective abortion, these are probably the two most common ones. It's discriminatory, and it's going to have broader population level issues. So in terms of creativity, they don't rank very highly. They're predictable. The other point I would say is that it would be better for the student, given the length of this paper, to just choose one of these points and develop it as fully as possible, instead of giving us 1 point and then moving to the next just a couple sentences later. Although both of these points could be true, are advancing the thesis that better to aim for depth over breadth, so just make 1 point and develop it fully. Let's read on. Thus, sex-selective abortion both grounds and acquiesces to gender-based discrimination. And sexism in our society is an indirect means of unethical population control and should be restricted. Okay, so that is summing up the argument. So based on both of those reasons, discrimination and population reasons, the student says should be restricted. Nice. So now we get a clear statement of what the student is arguing for. Sex-selective abortion shouldn't be permitted. One really little quibble though is this: the student says sex-selective abortion should be restricted. Now, when I think about a restriction, if you think about gun laws, you can have restricted gun laws, but you can still buy a gun. That's different from saying that there's a total prohibition, or it's impermissible, or there's a ban on buying guns. And so when I read that it should be restricted, I think that what the student is saying is that sex-selective abortion is wrong. But by saying should be restricted, that actually that word choice introduces an ambiguity. Does the student really mean that sex-selective abortion is wrong? Or do they mean, as they say, that there should be a restriction? Now, could be a full restriction, but it would just be clearer to say completely restricted or prohibited. Moving on. So that's the argument. Now let's go to the objection. The impetus of sex-selective abortion presents itself as a symptom and a response to a greater underlying societal problem in patriarchy, misogyny, sexism, and gender inequality. So some might believe that in and of itself, the argument is not about abortion, reproductive rights, and the right to bodily autonomy anymore. Instead, bodily autonomy of women will be more compromised should sex-selective abortion be restricted because of gender-based discrimination. Pregnant women should not be forced and coerced alone to shoulder the responsibility of the generational cycles of gendered oppression when the issue is a collective societal one. An elective abortion chosen by a pregnant woman only ensures that their body doesn't remain pregnant against their will, and restrictions against certain types of abortions violate this simple principle and justified right. Pregnant women have no individual moral obligation to address the issue of imbalanced human sex ratios and gender inequality within society, thus should not be forced to choose between these two ethical dilemmas and compromise one of their own right to bodily autonomy for the other. All right, I think that this is an excellent objection. So the student is saying that if we care about bodily autonomy, and if the reason why sex-selective abortions happen is because of oppression due to misogyny and patriarchy and so on, then banning sex-selective abortion further limits the autonomy of pregnant people to make a decision about their bodies. So that responds to the kind of individual autonomy-based argument. And then the student says, pregnant women have no individual moral obligation to address the issue of imbalanced human sex ratios and gender inequality within society. So this is another good response to the first point, the argument the student made, that allowing sex-selective abortions will cause an imbalance in the population. Students' objection is, that's not really something that every pregnant person should have to consider. That if a woman is considering whether to have an abortion, and even if she wants to do it because of the sex of the child or of the fetus, that's not a reason she shouldn't have to consider kind of like overall will the balance of males and females work out. So I think this is a good series of objections. It directly responds to the argument, and so it's good in that way, and it's plausible. Like, look, if we care about autonomy, then isn't this just another instance of autonomy? Shouldn't we care about that? So, good objection. I think that puts some pressure on the original view. Going on to the response. I argue a society that tolerates and permits sex-selective abortions is a society that does not see women as anything more than birthing machines, and that is the greater violation of their bodily autonomy. Sex-selective abortions, abortions due to disabilities, and the likes are not an elective choice by pregnant women when these abortions are often products of coercion and stereotypic conditioning. We cannot decree or ensure that pregnant women that choose not to carry a fetus of a devalued gender and instead have a sex-selective abortion are fully elective and autonomous in their decision when their free will is subject to discriminatory biases as well as cultural and familial pressures. In other words, the argument that a woman has a right to all abortions because she has a right to bodily autonomy is not so black and white when autonomy can be confounded and conformed by. I postulate that bodily autonomy is not their own if pregnant women are not valued as individuals to begin with, such that when a pregnant woman chooses to sex-selectively abort a devalued female fetus, they are devaluing themselves and their bodily autonomy. Okay, so let me talk about that so far. So the original argument is that sex-selective abortion is discriminatory, again, for gender reasons, and causes population problems. The response was that banning sex-selective abortion actually further interferes with the autonomy of women to make their choice about abortion. Then that's the objection. The response that the student is making now is that actually, when people are deciding to have an abortion based on the sex of the fetus, that they're probably doing that because of coercion and oppression in society. So it's not actually an autonomous choice in the first place. So this is an interesting view, and it might very well be right. I think that there's good reason to think that people don't just decide on their own to have a sex-selective abortion, that it has to do with kind of overall values in society. I'm usually wary of these kinds of claims. So the student says, just right off the top, that a society that tolerates and permits sex-selective abortion, a society that does not see women as anything more than birthing machines, and that is the greater violation of their bodily autonomy. I want to know more about why we should think that this is right. If you think that bodily autonomy is important, then how do we get from allowing sex-selective abortions, which seems like it's allowing more autonomy, to not seeing women as anything more than birthing machines? I think the argument, as the student elaborates, is that it's not really their choice at all, that people who have, as the student says, a sex-selective abortion, are not fully elective and autonomous in their decision when their free will is subject to discriminatory biases as well as cultural and familiar pressures. So I think that's what the story is supposed to be, but it's a big claim, and it's hard to give it enough support in just a short paragraph here. I further reason that pregnant women are not shouldering the responsibility of gender discrimination, but the responsibility of parenting instead. Gender depression is a societal issue and should be a shared responsibility with changes to cultural ethos, norms, equality laws, and education campaigns. With improving outcomes in both demographic and social levels, pregnant women carrying a fetus of either valued or devalued gender to term without a sex-selective abortion, and raising the fetus without a stereotypic discriminatory perspectives, truly prepares them for independence and what is true autonomy. So, if we need to kind of attack the problem from a lot of different ways, says the student. It's got to involve different laws and changing norms, and so on. Plausible argument. Once again, there are things you could kind of, because there are so many really big claims here, it's hard to really specifically identify the accuracy or how much support the student is giving to it. So, you might just think, well, if we're telling people that sex-selective abortion is wrong, you shouldn't do that, and we're going to ban you from doing that, isn't that also kind of giving them a cultural value? And maybe the answer is yes, but the cultural value is okay, it's ethically justified, but raises that kind of problem as well. So if your objection is that the values are just coming from society, and so that means they're not autonomous, then isn't this another case of that? So in all of these papers, these are short papers, the student is not going to be able to address every single issue. But that's one of the reasons to make it as focused as possible, to try to really kind of hone in on one specific argument and make sure that it's that you're really kind of being specific with it. So that's the overall view. In general, I think that this is a good paper. The student is making some interesting arguments. There's a nice back and forth. The objection directly objects to the argument. The response directly addresses the objection. As we've seen, I think that there are a few ways that the student could improve. One of them is clarity, that there are just some parts early on where it isn't clear what the student is arguing for. I think the second half of the paper is much clearer. The student really does a nice job. It's easy to follow. In terms of creativity, I think that there are ways to improve as well, that this is the sorts of arguments that the student gives are the predictable ones. That doesn't mean they're wrong. I think that they're good arguments against sex-selective abortion. But in terms of creativity, because they're so predictable, that means that they just end up being a bit less creative. In terms of difficulty in execution, I think that the difficulty is a little bit lower, that arguing, I think most people are against sex-selective abortion, and so even people who are otherwise pro-choice, I think, are often against sex-selective abortion. So the difficulty level is kind of medium to lower. And I think the execution is good. I think that there are ways to improve, but I think the student gives some nice arguments in favor of the view and ends up developing it well. So that's a paper that got a grade of B. In the next video, we're going to look at a paper that got a C. See you there.